Christmas Eve in Snowpine Ridge always carried a different kind of light. Warm, soft, a gold that felt as if it wrapped a thin mist over every worry. But that night, when Ada Merritt stepped into the town hall with the gift basket cradled carefully in both hands, that light wasn't enough to chase away the cold settling deep in her chest. People pressed shoulder to shoulder along the long tables, laughter chiming like silver bells, wool cloaks glinting under candlelight. Only Ada seemed to walk inside an invisible pocket of space, where every glance slid past her too quickly. The smile she tried to hold in place stiffened at the sound of a few whispers behind her. A couple passed by and subtly pulled their child aside, steering them out of Ada's path. No one touched her, but the avoidance stung more sharply than any shove. She kept walking, the way she had practiced for 2 years, learning how to move through a world that would rather she not be there at all. She set her basket on the table and stepped back, slipping into the crowd by making herself small enough not to be noticed. The room was thick with the scent of baked pastries, cinnamon, and freshly cut pine. Ada breathed in and told herself she could manage this. All she needed was to get through tonight. All she needed was for the town to look at her as part of the community. Just once more. Then the bidding reached her basket. Pastor Klein lifted it with both hands, his voice echoing, "A basket from Mrs. Ada Merritt. We'll start at $2. A cold hush dropped over the room like a bucket of icy water. No one moved. Someone coughed. A chair creaked. Ada stood frozen, fingers laced so tightly her knuckles numbed. Mrs. Miller's forced smile faded when her eyes accidentally met Ada's, then darted away, as if she'd seen something she shouldn't have. $2, the pastor repeated. Anyone? Still silence. A silence so long Ada could hear her own heartbeat, frantic and painful. She felt as if she were standing on a high platform, exposed to the entire town. A few women looked at her with a mix of pity and disdain, as though she were a stain on an otherwise spotless Christmas rug. $1, the pastor said softly, voice sagging. Just $1. Ada wanted to disappear, bury her face in her sleeve, turn and run straight into the snow outside. But her legs refused to move. Then the hall door opened with a long, old hinge groan. A gust of cold swept in, carrying the scent of mountains and damp pine. The crowd turned. A tall man stood in the doorway, his silhouette blocking most of the light behind him. His heavy coat was dusted with snow, his beard dark as the forest. Ada recognized him at once. Calder Nash, the man who lived alone on the High Pine Ridge, who came to town only a few times each year. Calder didn't look at anyone else. His gaze went straight to Ada's basket. $20, he said, his deep voice cutting through the silence like an axe into dry wood. The room stirred. $20 for Ada's basket, 3 times the price of the finest one that night. The pastor nearly stumbled over his words. "Are you certain, Calder?" Calder stepped forward and set a pouch of money on the table, the coins clinking sharply. He nodded, offering no explanations. Ada's throat tightened, not out of gratitude, out of fear for the gossip that would surely follow. But when Calder turned toward her, his eyes carried no trace of pity. They were steady, clear, as if he saw her, a whole person, not the rumors that clung to her name. He tilted his head slightly, a quiet question whether she would share supper with him. Ada nodded, legs trembling. As they settled at a small table in the corner, the noise around them faded. Ada opened the basket, her hands shaking. Calder reached to help, and his fingertips brushed the back of hers. just a brief touch, light as breath. Yet it tightened something deep in her chest. She pulled her hand back, but Calder didn't smile, didn't fluster. He simply watched her with a calm, grounded gaze, as if that touch wasn't a mistake but something natural between two strangers carrying the same kind of loneliness. "Thank you," Ada whispered. Calder answered in his low, steady way. "No one should stand alone in a room like that." A simple sentence, yet it fell over Ada like a gentle hand resting on the place she'd been hiding for so long, the place that hurt the most. And Christmas Eve, which she thought would end in humiliation, shifted into something she never dared to imagine. Heading home from the town hall, Ada Merritt guided her old wagon along the snow-covered road that wound toward the northern edge of town. Night fell quickly, swallowing the wooden roofs and the bare trees standing like sentinels across the white fields. When she reached the crest overlooking Snowpine Ridge, she turned back. The warm glow of the church and storefront windows formed a soft, hazy patch of light, near enough to touch, yet far enough to remind her it was a world she had tried to enter, but never truly belonged to. Ada's homestead sat deep in the valley, a small cabin her husband had built with his own hands 5 years earlier. An old pine tree shielded the back from the wind, and a short fence framed the patch of land she had fought to keep through 2 long winters. The woodshed leaned heavily to one side, snow pressing down as if determined to bring it to the ground. But to Ada, it was still home, the place where laughter once lived, where breath once warmed the air, even if everything else had left her. Her husband, Elijah, died on an autumn afternoon while cutting timber for the mining company. They said it was an accident, a log slipping from the pulley, a hard strike to the head. When they brought him home, his coat still sticky with pine resin, his eyes closed as if caught in a dream not yet finished. Ada couldn't remember how long she cried. She only remembered standing motionless by the door, gripping the hem of his coat, as if holding it long enough might bring the warmth back. A few months later, their young daughter June burned with fever in the bitter winter cold. Ada tried everything, warm water, herbal remedies, wiping her down through the night, holding her close to keep every last bit of heat alive. But the fever rose against every prayer. June died in Ada's arms at dawn, when the mountain wind hit so hard the windows rattled. Ada held the small body tight, convinced that loosening her grip even for a moment would cause the whole world to shatter. After that, Snowpine Ridge changed the way it looked at hers. To many, Ada was not only a widow, she was a black widow, living alone with no family to support her and no husband to shield her. In a mountain town like this, that alone was enough to spark gossip. They never said it plainly, but Ada heard it in the glances, in the murmurs drifting behind her back. "A woman like her never fits in here. That child died because she didn't know what she was doing. You know how colored women are. There's always trouble." Ada never argued. She survived the only way she knew how, quietly. By day, she mended clothes for townsfolk, sometimes sold eggs or a few woven rugs. In spring, she grew vegetables. In winter, she tightened every expense, telling herself that if she could just make it through the deep snows, the world would open one small path forward. But the coldest nights were the true test. Ada often sat by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, watching, the snow fall thick outside the window like scattered ash. The small cabin filled with shadows, and in those shadows she heard her past. June's laughter, Elijah's hammer striking wood, the wind pounding the walls back when the 3 of them still dreamed together. She wondered what she had left now, and why the town kept stepping back every time she tried to step forward. That was why Ada had made a Christmas basket this year, not to win, not to impress, but to send out one small signal that she was still here, that she wished to be part of Snowpine Ridge, even in the smallest way. Yet when the hall fell silent around her, cold and heavy as frost settling on her shoulders, Ada understood that her presence still wasn't welcome. Only one person had looked at her differently. Calder Nash. He wasn't like the people of Snowpine Ridge. He came and went like a mountain shadow, quiet and distant. But the way he looked at her tonight, Ada could still feel it as she sat before the fire now. A gaze that didn't evade, didn't judge. A gaze that saw her as if she were the only person in that room, not someone standing at the far edge of every conversation. Ada didn't know why Calder had paid $20. But in that moment, she felt seen, truly seen for the first time in a long while, and that alone warmed her chest, even as the snow outside kept falling thick and cold. Snow fell for 3 days after the auction night, piling across the entrance to Ada's homestead in a white layer that reached halfway up her calf. She rose earlier than usual, lit the fire, brewed a pot of ginger tea, then carried her axe outside to split the few logs she had left. Winter was barely halfway through, and her supply was dwindling faster than she had planned. Ada pulled her wool scarf up over half her face, breathed in the cold air, and raised the axe. But after only 2 swings, she heard steady, heavy footsteps pressing into the snow. Calder Nash stood at the gate. She hadn't seen him come. It was as if he had stepped straight out of the gray mist drifting behind the pines. Snow clung to his dark hair, and his heavy coat hung loosely over his shoulders. He didn't speak under Ada's startled gaze. He simply walked forward and eased the axe from her hands with a slow, wordless gesture that felt like asking permission without using a sound. "What are you doing here?" Ada asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Your woodpile's running low," Calder said, eyes fixed on the logs. "I didn't ask for help." "I know." He spoke as he always did. Few words, each one as solid as a fence post. His first swing hit with a clean, sharp crack that made Ada flinch. By the time she stepped inside to put away the morning dishes, Calder had already split a large pile, stacked neatly and firmly, so exact it looked like a wall of timber. Ada watched from the porch, uneasy gratitude tugging at her. She wasn't used to accepting help, especially from men in town. No one ever helped her without whispering afterward. But Calder, he demanded nothing, said nothing to make her feel small. He simply worked, silent and steady. Before she could thank him, she stepped down from the porch, and her boot hit a thin layer of ice beneath the snow. She slipped. A cold rush shot up her spine, but Calder's warm, firm hand caught her elbow just in time. Ada fell lightly against his chest. Her breath snagged as she felt the strength beneath his coat, the heat radiating through her own thin layers so quickly her ears burned. Calder released her at once, as though afraid of overstepping. Ada stepped back, cheeks warmer than the morning fire. "Sorry," he said, voice low and unexpectedly gentle for a man of his size. I'm fine," Ada murmured, avoiding his eyes, but her hands still tingled where he had touched her. A cold wind swept past them, bringing the sharp scent of pine, and the space between them deepened in a way she could feel. Ada turned away, partly to catch her breath, partly to hide the fluster rising in her. "Come inside for tea. It's freezing." Calder nodded. Inside, the warmth of the wood stove chased away the bite of the outdoors. Ada poured tea into 2 clay cups and set one before him. Calder looked around the small cabin, as if reading a story, through its simple objects: the carefully folded baby blanket, the chair Elijah once used, the well-kept books. He didn't ask, but Ada felt that if he did, she would answer, and that frightened her. They shared lunch, a bowl of bean soup she had made the day before, bread warmed back to life. Not a special meal, but the soft clink of spoons, the rising steam, and the quiet ease between them made the small room feel larger. Calder told a few small stories about his recent trip into the deep woods, where the snow was so thick each step sounded muffled. He spoke slowly, plainly, without boasting. Ada listened, realizing how long it had been since someone had spoken to her with simple kindness. By afternoon, Calder stood and pulled on his hat. "I'll come back to fix the east fence. The snow's bending the joints." "I don't want to trouble you," Ada said, though her tone lacked any real refusal. Calder tilted his head, meeting her eyes with a gentleness she hadn't known in years. "Not a trouble. Just something that needs doing." He left the way he came. Few words, sure steps, leaving behind a warmth she wasn't prepared for. Ada closed the door and stood still in the quiet room. She placed a hand over her chest, where the trace of that brief touch still lingered. Something was shifting, small, fragile, but real as the heat of the stove. Even so, Ada held a secret she could not bring herself to speak. A piece of her past she feared would make Calder turn away like everyone else. But on that snowy afternoon, for the first time in years, Ada wondered. Maybe not everyone would turn their back. Through the long days of snowfall, Calder Nash appeared at Ada Merritt's homestead so often that neither of them bothered asking why anymore. Sometimes he arrived only to rekindle the dying fire in her stove, sometimes to bring a new bundle of wood, and sometimes with nothing at all, just standing at the door, knocking 3 familiar times before stepping inside. A new rhythm settled between them, one without planning or promises, forming as naturally as breath. Each morning, Ada sat at the wooden table, heating water on the stove. When the first murmur of boiling began, soft as a small song, the door would open, and Calder would walk in, brushing snow from his coat before taking the cup she offered. They sat quietly for a while, one at each side of the table, the warmth of the fire mingling with the rising steam. They didn't need many words. Each knew the other was there, and that was enough. By noon, Calder was usually still somewhere around the homestead, mending the fence, checking the roof of the chicken coop, clearing the walkway. Ada made soup or warmed bread, dividing it between them. Some days Calder told her about seeing deer tracks along the ridge. Some days he only nodded when she asked how his morning had been. But his eyes never carried distance. If anything, every time he looked at her, a quiet gentleness tightened something in Ada's chest, an unmistakable sense of being seen, not because of her skin, not because of rumors, but because she was herself. One windy afternoon, Ada stepped outside to call him in for lunch when she realized her scarf had slipped loose. As she fumbled with it, Calder walked up behind her and touched the edge of the cloth. "Let me," he said. Ada went still. His hands came forward, adjusting the knot, his fingers brushing the skin at her neck. The gesture was simple, but his warmth made her hold her breath. When Calder stepped back, Ada turned away to hide the smile forming, one she thought she had lost years ago. Another evening, Ada was tending the fire when she heard him call from the yard. She went out to find a streak of ash on his cheek he hadn't noticed. Ada let out a soft laugh, light as thread. "Hold still," she said, lifting her hand. Her fingertips brushed his cheek, wiping away the gray smudge. For a moment, both of them stopped. Calder looked at her with something deep, a quiet gratitude, a silent acknowledgement. Ada drew her hand back, though her gaze lingered. "Thank you," he said, voice so low it nearly dissolved into breath. There were also small moments, when they walked through the narrow stable door and Ada's shoulder brushed his. A slight touch, barely anything, yet each time it happened, her heartbeat jumped faster than the wind outside. Calder would pause too, as though he felt the touch more deeply than he allowed himself to show. Little by little, the sorrow in Ada's eyes eased. She smiled more softly. The heaviness she had carried for 2 years didn't vanish, but it shifted, making room for something else, a faint, steady light. One night, with the wind howling through the cracks and both of them seated by the hearth, Ada asked the question she had held back for a long time. "Why, do you live alone in the mountains?" Calder didn't answer immediately. He watched the flames, his hand tightening slightly. "My wife," he said slowly, "and the child we never got to meet." Ada felt her heart drop. "They died in a landslide," Calder continued. "I couldn't save them. The house I built collapsed in front of me, like the earth wanted to take everything I loved." Ada set her cup down, her eyes stinging. "I understand," she said softly. "Losing someone never truly ends." Calder turned toward her. In the firelight, something in his gaze softened, a look that only surfaced when an old wound finally found a place to rest. "I know," he murmured. "You understand, too." Ada nodded, her throat tight. Two hearts, both scarred by loss, found recognition in each other's quiet grief, an understanding that needed no long explanations. That night, when Calder left the homestead, Ada stood at the door, watching his figure fade into the falling snow. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel alone in the White Valley. She was stepping into a new rhythm, one that included Calder. The snow had eased, but the air in Snowpine Ridge still felt coated with a thin layer of ice that refused to melt. Ada sensed it on Monday morning, when Pastor Halden and 2 women from the church committee appeared at her cabin door. Their knock was measured, practiced, meant to sound friendly, though the tone beneath it told another story. Ada opened the door. The 3 stood in a row, like a curtain meant to block her from the world outside. "Merritt," Pastor Halden said with a nod, his voice low yet carrying something that was not quite goodwill. "We'd like to speak with you. A delicate matter." Ada pulled her shawl closer and motioned for them to come in. But Mrs. Whitlow, the tall, narrow woman with needle-like eyes, lifted a hand to stop her. "No need to go inside," she said. "This will only take a moment." The pastor sighed, then spoke plainly. "We've heard Calder Nash has been visiting your home rather often. Snowpine Ridge is a small town. Word travels fast." Ada kept her expression steady. "He's helping me fix the fence. There's nothing improper." The second woman, Mrs. Renly, stepped forward. Her voice was soft, but sharp as a blade. "Some believe you're trying to use a man's kindness to change your standing here." A quiet flame stirred in Ada's chest, but she only pressed her lips together. 2 years had taught her that defending herself only gave gossip firmer ground. Mrs. Whitlow smiled, a tight, triumphant curl. "We're simply reminding you. A colored widow already struggles to be accepted. Getting involved with a man like Calder, a recluse with a past no one knows, may not be wise." Ada drew a long breath. We're not doing anything wrong. Perhaps the wrong, Mrs. Whitlow replied, is that you think you're entitled to try. A gust of wind cut across the porch, making the door groan. Ada stood straight as a pine in a blizzard, unshaken, though the cold seeped into her bones. After they left, she sat at the table for a long while, not touching the cup of tea cooling beside her. She knew this town could be harsh, but today's words struck the tenderest place in her heart, the fear that Calder would suffer because of her. And in Snowpine Ridge, reputation could weigh heavier than winter snow. That afternoon, Ada went into town to buy candles. The general store was crowded. She had barely stepped inside when a familiar voice carried from the back, Sarah Whitlow's sharp, taunting tones slicing through the room like shears through cloth. "Oh, look, Mrs. Merritt, buying supplies for your regular visitor up on the mountain?" Conversation in the store died instantly. Ada stopped, her fingers tightening around her shawl until they went pale. Sarah walked forward, her smile edged like broken glass. "It's almost sad, really, trying to climb higher by clinging to the first man willing to give you attention. Isn't that right?" Ada didn't bow her head, but her eyes darkened, still as a storm-touched lake. Then the back door of the store swung open. Calder Nash stepped inside. He paused long enough to take in the scene, then moved behind Ada, close but not touching her. He stood tall, steady as a mountain pine, his presence falling over her like a shield. The room fell silent. Sarah swallowed. "I was only saying—" Calder cut her off, his voice low but unmistakably clear. "No one has the right to speak of her that way." No anger, no raised voice, just a statement, solid as oak, that hollowed the room of sound. Ada felt warmth at her back, not from fire but from a kind of protection she had not known in years. Sarah stepped back. The others turned away, suddenly busy with anything else. Calder leaned slightly toward Ada, his voice meant for her alone. "They don't determine your worth." Ada closed her eyes for a breath. Only one breath, but enough to keep herself from breaking. Outside, Ada walked ahead a few steps, Calder following. Snow drifted softly, melting as it touched her hair. "Calder," Ada whispered, her voice trembling. "You didn't have to. I don't want you dragged into this." Calder stopped, turning her toward him. "You didn't drag me in," he said. "I stepped in because I chose to." The wind swept down the empty street, but Ada felt warmth rise in her chest, stronger than any room in Snowpine Ridge could offer. And in that moment, among falling snow and fading daylight, Ada understood that her fear was smaller than Calder's presence. Whatever the rest of the world chose, she knew he would not turn away. The snowstorm lasted 3 days, covering the mountains in a heavy white blanket that pressed down on every sound. By late afternoon of the 3rd day, Calder Nash rode down the slope with a restlessness he couldn't shake. The cold wind struck his face, but what worried him most was the small cabin in the valley, the place where Ada Merritt lived alone. When he knocked, the sound landed like an extra heartbeat. Ada opened the door, and for an instant her face lit, though she tried to steady it. "I thought you might have been trapped up there," she said, her voice soft, edged with a faint tremor. "I thought you might have been trapped," Calder replied, brushing snow from his coat as he stepped inside. The cabin was warm, but not enough to chase away the chill the storm had sown into the air. The fire in the stove crackled, casting amber light across Ada's face, making her eyes shimmer with something unspoken. They sat side by side before the hearth. Outside, dusk deepened, and the wind dragged its voice along the wooden walls like the mountain breathing out a long sigh. The space between them tightened, inch by inch, not by intention, but by something that neither resisted. Ada put her hand near the fire and flinched slightly at the heat. Calder reached out, touching her hand to see whether she was burned. Just a touch, but the moment stilled. Their hands didn't part. "I'm all right," Ada whispered. Yet she didn't pull away. Calder looked down at where their fingers rested together, then back to her face. The firelight softened her features, stirring something steady and aching inside him, like watching an old wound begin to close. "I worry about you," he said, voice low and honest. "More than I mean to." Ada turned her head, but not fast enough. He still caught the flicker in her eyes, held calm by effort, but unable to hide the rising emotion beneath. A loose curl had fallen across her forehead. Calder reached up, brushing it aside with a touch so slow it felt like a question. Ada closed her eyes for a breath as his fingers passed her temple. Their breaths now were very near. "Calder," she whispered, his name turning into a confession. He didn't speak, but when she set her hand on his chest, right over his heart, he froze as though she had touched a place he'd kept barricaded since the day he lost his wife and the child he never met. His heartbeat was strong and quick, impossible to hide. Ada looked at him with quiet depth, steady and bare. "You're lonely, the way I am," she said. Calder nodded faintly. "For a long time." That truth, simple and painful, dissolved the last distance between them. He wrapped his arms around her, not in haste but as if gathering something precious he feared to lose again. Ada leaned into him, fingers gripping his shirt, her breath trembling against his chest like the wind murmuring against the eaves. Outside the storm continued, but inside the cabin something warmer than fire took hold. They rested against each other, silent. Two people who had braced against the world for too long and had finally found a place to let their guard drop. There were no more words. None were needed. Their closeness came not from fleeting desire, but from the depth of their solitude, from trust built out of weeks of quiet gestures. Night slowly folded over the cabin, and the warmth of their bodies blended. Gentle, steady, unhurried. It wasn't a moment of firework flare. It was a moment like a wound closing, painful, but healing. When Ada awoke, the fire had burned down to faint red embers. She lay in Calder's arms, her head resting against his chest, feeling the rhythm of his breathing through her hair. Calder was still asleep, one arm holding her as though afraid she might vanish. Ada looked at him, and a trembling warmth swept through her. But beneath it, a worry slipped in. Where would this lead? What would the town say? Would she bring Calder into the same harsh judgment she'd carried for years? She placed her hand on his chest again, over that same spot. His heart still beat strong. Calder stirred in his sleep, pulling her closer in an unconscious motion. Ada closed her eyes. She knew she had stepped onto a path far from easy, but last night, a night as gentle as a prayer, had shown her this. Some things are worth walking toward, even if the whole world stands against you. And perhaps she wasn't walking alone anymore. After the snowstorm and the night they shared their warmth, Ada's cabin felt touched by a gentler air, softer, steadier. But peace in Snowpine Ridge was always fragile. Sometimes all it took was a knock at the door to bring it crashing down. That morning, as Ada was preparing breakfast, a rapid pounding sounded across the cabin. 3 men stood on the porch, 2 from town, the third from a county law office. One look at their stiff posture told Ada what was coming. "They said they needed to speak with you," Calder said, as he stepped in from the barn, bits of straw still clinging to him. When he caught the change in Ada's face, his expression hardened at once. The man with the satchel didn't waste time. "We've been asked to review Mrs. Merritt's prior custody case. There are details that were never fully clarified." Ada's heart tightened. That old story, the one she had buried so deep, had been dragged back into the open. Not because she'd done anything wrong, but because someone in Snowpine Ridge wanted their cruel suspicions confirmed. Unclear details was only an excuse. Calder stepped forward, angling himself slightly in front of Ada. "Why is this being reopened now?" he asked, voice low. The man didn't flinch. "We received an anonymous letter. It claims Mrs. Merritt nearly lost custody of her child. We're required to verify." Ada closed her eyes for a single breath, then opened them, ready to face the truth she had avoided. Calder turned to her, but she looked away. "Is it true, Ada?" he asked quietly, not with doubt, but concern. The room blurred. The men were still there, but she heard nothing more. Old dust from old wounds filled her chest. She drew in a breath. "I'll speak about it, but only to Calder." Perhaps they sensed the shimmer of tears in her eyes, or the firm set of her shoulders, but the men withdrew. When the door shut behind them, the cabin fell into a silence so deep she could hear the wood adjusting to the heat. Calder stepped closer without touching her. "You don't have to tell me yet," he murmured. Ada shook her head. "No, Calder. I have to, before you think something worse." She sat at the kitchen table. Her hands trembled so hard she had to lace them together. "After Eli, my late husband, died," Ada began, voice soft as winter wind, "his family didn't want me raising Lucy anymore. They said a colored woman wasn't fit, not acceptable, not someone society would approve of." Calder listened, still as stone. "They filed a petition, tried to take her from me. Their claim," Ada swallowed, eyes burning, "was that I wasn't suitable to raise a white child, that I was poor, alone, without anyone to stand for me." A small, bitter laugh escaped her, thin and pained. "And this town believed it. They whispered that I was unfit, irresponsible, that I didn't know how to care for my own child. I tried everything. But when Lucy became fevered, they said, she died because of my ignorance." Her voice broke. "I lost Lucy, Calder. I lost her. And at the same time, they made me believe it was my fault." Calder knelt before her, but kept his hands to himself, leaving space for her to choose. Ada's voice grew smaller. "I didn't tell you because, if you knew, you might leave. I can't bear one more person looking at me like they did." Calder didn't speak right away. He slowly reached out, placing his hand over hers, careful, unhurried, giving her every chance to pull away. But Ada tightened her grip instead, holding on as if to a new heartbeat. At last he spoke, each word firm as the mountain. "Ada, you deserve love. You don't deserve judgment from people who fear what's different." She cried, not from being pushed down again, but because someone finally pulled her back from the edge. Calder gathered her into his arms, holding her as though he meant to keep every shattered piece from falling. I'm not leaving, he whispered. Not now. Not because of your past. Not because of gossip. Not because of anything they say. Ada clutched his shirt, her breath trembling against him. In Calder's arms, she felt, perhaps for the first time in years, that she was not someone left behind, not someone insufficient, but someone chosen, someone allowed to stay, someone loved. Rumors traveled faster than mountain wind. They began as a whisper in the dressmaker's shop, then a passing remark in the general store, and by week's end, all of Snowpine Ridge knew Calder Nash had spent the night at Ada Merritt's cabin. In a town that already saw Ada as a thorn, the story became a spark thrown into dry grass. People looked at Ada with sharper, heavier eyes. No longer suspicion or distance, judgment. As she walked across the street, stray comments floated behind her like cold blades. She seduces men to lift her station. Women like that only bring trouble. Bet she's using tricks to keep him around. Ada heard it all. She never responded. But each time she returned to her cabin, her shoulders seemed a little lower. Calder wasn't spared either. When he came to town for supplies, a group of men lingering outside the saloon threw out their taunts. Calder, heard that colored widow's put a spell on you. Shame. Thought you had more sense. Another added with a laugh. Guess you're just that lonely. Anyone will do. Calder didn't answer with his fists, though many expected he would. He only stood straight, his silence heavy enough to make them lower their eyes. Then he walked away, but the air around him felt taut, as if the mountain itself was bracing for a slide. On Sunday, Ada chose to go to church, not to defy anyone, not to prove anything, simply because, all her life, church had been the closest thing to peace, and she refused to let gossip exile her from it. When Ada stepped inside, the room fell into an unnatural stillness. Soft conversations faded, replaced by cold stares, flat and frozen like a winter lake. Ada sat in the last pew, head slightly bowed. Calder sat beside her, not too close, not too far, close enough to show he stood with her, far enough not to stir more trouble. Pastor Halden was about to open the Bible when the church door swung open. Sarah Whitlow strode in, tall, lean, and full of challenge. Before taking her seat, she looked around the room, then fixed her gaze on Ada. "What a disappointment," she said, loud enough for Rose to hear. "God's house is for decent families, not for people living together without marriage." A wave of murmurs rippled through the sanctuary. Ada stiffened. She didn't lift her head, but her heart hammered painfully. Pastor Halden stepped forward. "Mrs. Whitlow, please," but Sarah cut him off. "She disgraces this town. She uses Calder's kindness to drag him into the mud. And now she sits here as though she's done nothing wrong." Ada heard the scrape of a wooden pew as Calder rose. A small movement, yet it hushed the entire church. He stepped into the aisle, turning toward Sarah. Light from the window fell across his face, clear, calm, sharp as a blade slicing through silence. "I am not enchanted by anyone," he said. "I go to Ada's cabin because I choose to. I stand with her because she deserves kindness." Sarah let out a thin, mocking laugh. "And you defend her for what reason?" Calder leaned slightly forward, his voice low but carrying through every corner. "Because the way you treat a woman who has lost everything is the most shameful thing I've seen in this town." Ada breathed in sharply, like someone finally pulled above water. Calder continued, not louder, but firmer. "I will not leave Ada. The more you try to divide us, the closer I stand to her." No one replied. Even Sarah Whitlow had no words left. But what Ada didn't expect came after the service ended. A small group of women approached her. Not the loud ones, not the gossipers, but those whose eyes held old sorrow, wounds not fully healed. Emma Brooke, who lost a child last year. Nora Tillman, mistreated for years by her husband's family. Mrs. Higgins, who buried 2 children to winter fever. They stood before Ada like a quiet shield. "We know that pain," Emma said softly, "and we know you're not what they say." Nora touched Ada's arm. "A mother who's lost a child cannot be cruel. We understand." Mrs. Higgins nodded. "If you need anything, you come to us. You're not alone." Ada couldn't speak. Her throat closed, her eyes burning. Calder stood behind her, silent, steady, not taking attention, not stepping forward, simply a wall of strength at her back. And for the first time, Ada felt the cold wind of Snowpine Ridge no longer cutting through her. She had someone beside her. And now, not just one. A small circle of women, hearts once broken, had quietly formed around her. And that, she realized, was the first true sign of hope. The morning after the stormy church service, Ada still felt the weight lingering in her chest. Though Calder had stood beside her like a wall, though a few women had stepped toward her in quiet solidarity, the sense of being stared at as an outsider clung to her like frost on the cabin window. She had just lit the stove when a knock sounded. Light, steady, not the hesitant or hostile kind she'd grown used to. Ada opened the door and found 3 women standing on the porch. Martha Callahan, Nora Tillman, and Mrs. Higgins. Martha smiled, a warm smile that seemed to melt a bit of the snow on the steps. "We came to visit," she said. "No other reason." Ada stepped aside to let them in. The cabin was small but bright. The stove was warming, and a faint herbal scent drifted in the air. The women removed their coats and sat around the old wooden table. For a moment, no one spoke. Not out of awkwardness, but as if giving Ada space to breathe. At last, Nora set her hand on the table, her voice small but firm. "Yesterday was hard. We know." Ada lowered her head. "I don't know what to say." "No need," Martha answered gently. "We didn't come to hear excuses. We came because we understand. Each in our own way." Nora drew a quiet breath. "My husband's family threw me off the farm right after he died. Said I wasn't good enough to keep their land. I know the feeling of being stripped of your place, even when you've done nothing wrong." Mrs. Higgins nodded. "I lost 2 little ones to winter fever. Folks whispered that I didn't care for them well enough. No one asked how many nights I stayed awake or how much I tried to keep them breathing." Ada looked up. 3 faces, 3 lives, 1 shared grief. Women who had carried their pain for years were sitting here now, in her small cabin. Martha opened a linen-wrapped bundle. "We made this for you." Ada unfolded it. A small quilt, patched from pieces of different fabrics, colors, and textures. Not perfect, but every square held careful stitching and quiet sincerity. "A welcome gift," Martha said. "Not for a child, not for anyone else. For you. A reminder that you have a place in this town. Not everyone stands against you." Ada touched the soft fabric, her fingers trembling. "I didn't think I deserved anyone on my side." Mrs. Higgins laid a hand over Ada's. "You deserve more than the words thrown at you. We all know what judgment feels like. And like you, we're still standing." Nora smiled. "Any woman who's been hurt and still rises, will always find others like herself. Ada felt her eyes burn, not from injury this time, but from being seen, recognized as a whole person rather than a shadow shaped by rumor. That afternoon, Calder arrived after walking through town, snow scattered across his coat. Ada looked at him and sensed a faint tension in his shoulders. "They're still talking?" she asked softly, though she dreaded the answer. Calder shrugged. "Some are, but some have gone quiet." Quiet because they're tired of the story, or because you defended me. He met her eyes, gray, clear, unflinching. Both, but there's something else. What? A few men said, "At least Calder stands for what's right." Someone clapped my shoulder. Someone else said they respected how I handled it. Ada blinked, surprised. She had expected harsher consequences for him. "I didn't think Snowpine Ridge could change at all." "Not the whole town," Calder said, "but a few people. And sometimes, a few is enough." He looked toward the quilt on the table. "They came here?" Ada nodded. "I don't know how to thank them." Calder touched the back of her chair, close enough for his warmth to reach her without touching her. "You're not alone anymore, Ada." Those words, simple, steady, fell into her heart like warm rain after a long winter. Ada looked at the quilt, then at Calder. Not everyone had changed, but a few had seen her. A few had stepped beside her. And sometimes, that was the beginning of an entire new spring. Snow fell through the afternoon, not fiercely, but softly, like breath. The small white flakes drifted onto Ada's cabin roof without making a sound. The whole valley rested under a gentle stillness, slowing the world to a quiet pulse. Ada stood on the porch, holding the new quilt, the gift the women had sewn, folded carefully in her arms. Now and then she reached out to catch a snowflake melting against her skin. Each one was cold, yet not cutting, as if winter itself had softened for reasons she could not yet name. Calder returned from town as the sky shifted into a blue-gray dusk. He led his horse to the shed, brushed snow off his coat, then walked directly to Ada. His steps were unhurried, but carried the certainty of someone who had long decided what he intended to say. "You all right?" Calder asked. Ada nodded, though her eyes held a trace of unease. Everything is happening so fast." He stood before her, and a long silence settled, a silence that wasn't awkward, but one that felt like two hearts finding a shared rhythm. "We need to talk," he said. Ada tightened her hold on the quilt. "I figured." He touched her elbow lightly, then withdrew, a gesture respectful, but edged with restrained longing. "Walk with me?" They made their way behind the cabin to the open stretch facing the snowy slope. Twilight cast a pale, silvery wash over everything, making the landscape look sketched in cool chalk. Their breaths mingled in the cold air. Ada stopped when he stopped. She began to speak, but the look in his eyes made the words fade in her throat. "There's something I've known for a while," he began, voice low and steady. "That even if the whole town turned its back, I'd still stand beside you." Ada looked down, hands trembling. "Calder, I'm just afraid I'll make life harder for you." "No," he said softly, cutting in. "What scares me is the thought that you might believe you have to face everything alone." Ada lifted her gaze. Her eyes glimmered as though misted over. Calder breathed in, then stepped closer. slowly, intentionally. "I choose you, Ada," he said. "Not because you need me, not because you're hurting, but because I want to be part of your life. I want to belong somewhere, and that place is beside you." Her hands shook harder now, strength draining from them. Snow settled on her shoulders, melting into tiny beads of water. And then Calder knelt. No ring, no flowers, no flourish. Only a man who had lived too long in the shadow of loss, now placing his heart in her hands. "Ada Merritt," he said, his voice threaded with emotion yet steady as the mountain. "Will you marry me? Let me stand before you and behind you. Let me protect you without anyone calling it foolish. Let me love you with everything I have." Ada lifted both hands to her lips, but her tears had already broken free. "Calder, I—" He met her gaze without urgency, without fear, only a quiet flame of sincerity. "You don't have to answer this second," he murmured. "But know this, I choose you, not out of duty, not out of pity, not for anyone's approval. I simply don't feel whole without you." Ada gasped softly. Through all her years of being dismissed, judged, treated like a shadow without worth, no one had ever told her she was chosen, that she deserved love without asking permission. She drew in a deep breath, snow touching her lashes. "I will," she whispered. The words were small, but her heart had never spoken anything with more certainty. Calder rose, and before he could respond, Ada stepped into his arms. No hesitation, no fear, no glancing around to see who might witness it. Just the embrace of someone who had finally found the place she belonged. Calder wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close as though shielding her from the winter itself. "You truly mean it?" he asked, warm breath brushing her ear. Ada laughed through her tears. "I've never meant anything more." Calder rested his forehead against hers. "Then, we'd best start planning a wedding." In the gentle snowfall, under the blue-silver sky, two people long torn apart by life found each other again, in a promise that needed no applause, only truth. A small wedding would come, not grand, not blessed by the whole town, but a wedding built on two hearts beating the same steady rhythm they had waited years to find. The wedding day arrived in the hush of winter. No church bells, no procession, no long white dress. Only a small cabin on the hillside, candlelight glowing through frosted windows, and a gentle warmth in the wooden room where Ada Merritt stood preparing for a moment she had never dared imagine. She wore a simple deep blue dress she had kept since her years in Ohio, one of the few keepsakes she hadn't abandoned through all her losses. She adjusted the collar, her hands trembling not from cold, but from the rare sensation of stepping into something that felt meant for her. Martha Callahan and Nora Tillman helped fasten her hair. Candlelight flickered across Ada's face, making her look touched by something warm and quiet. "You look beautiful," Nora said. Ada smiled, eyes shimmering. "I never thought I'd see this day." Martha set her hands on Ada's shoulders, her gaze deep with the understanding of someone who had weathered many storms. "You deserve happiness, Ada. Don't ever doubt that again." Calder waited in the main room, wearing a plain vest he had reluctantly agreed to let someone tailor. The candlelight settled on the firm, hopeful lines of his face. When Ada stepped out, Calder lifted his head, and for that moment, every wind, every rumor, every shadow of the past seemed to fall still. There was no dramatic gasp, no loud praise, just a quiet, steady look, two people recognizing a truth that had always been waiting. Their lives had been written toward each other. "Ready?" he asked softly. Ada nodded, and the moment turned sacred. Pastor Halden opened the Bible, his voice calm and low. "We gather not to display joy, but to witness two souls choose each other after life has tried them to their limits." Ada bowed her head. Calder held her hand lightly, as if holding a petal, yet firmly enough to warm her heart through and through. The ceremony had only 4 witnesses, but peace did not last. Footsteps stamped hard through the snow. A familiar cluster of faces appeared. Sarah Whitlow, Lucy Bramwell, and 2 men known for their jeers outside the saloon. The door flew open. Cold wind rushed in. "Who gave you permission for this secret wedding?" Sarah snapped. "You disgrace the town, then try to hide your scandal?" Ada shrank back, but Martha stepped forward like a shield. "That's enough, Sarah." "No," Sarah's chin lifted. "The town deserves to know what kind of improper union is being legitimized." Nora Tillman stepped directly in front of her, meeting her gaze without flinching. "And the town deserves to know we will no longer stand by while a widow is shredded because of her color and her sorrow." Silence rippled across the room. For the first time, Sarah Whitlow's accusations met not isolation, but unity. Behind Martha stood Mrs. Higgins and Emma Brooke, forming a quiet line. No shouting, no bravado, only a moral wall Sarah could not pierce. Calder stepped beside Ada, not angry, not loud, just present, his posture a wordless vow. To reach her, they would have to go through him. Sarah looked around, realizing she no longer commanded the room. She stepped back, stung by the loss of control. Without another word, she turned and left. Her group followed. When the door closed, the wind outside felt less cold. Pastor Halden resumed the ceremony. Ada looked at Calder as they exchanged vows. Calder spoke first, voice deep, faintly trembling. "I choose you. When you're strong, when you're afraid, when you doubt yourself. I choose you in the light, and I choose you in the dark. I will stand before you when the wind is fierce and behind you when you need someone at your back." Ada answered, her voice soft as falling snow, but firm as oak. "I won't promise perfection, but I promise I won't give up. Not on you, not on us." Pastor Halden nodded. "I pronounce you husband and wife." Calder cupped Ada's face with slow, reverent hands, as if giving her time to reconsider. Ada smiled, true in a way she hadn't felt in years. They kissed in candlelight, not as an ending, but as a beginning. Outside, snow drifted across the cabin roof. Inside, 2 people once shattered by life began writing a new chapter, held together by a tenderness strong enough to outlast any storm. Spring arrived late in Snow Pine Ridge. Not loudly, not hurriedly. It came through pale sunlight slipping between pine branches, through the warm scent of soil revealed after the last patches of snow melted, through the timid notes of small birds trying to find their voices again after a long winter. Ada Merritt stood outside the cabin, her hand touching the freshly turned earth. Calder knelt nearby, checking the rows they had spent the morning laying out together. "The soil's soft here," he said, his voice low but unusually light. "Wild roses will take root well." Ada knelt beside him. "And here?" Calder placed his hand gently over hers, guiding it toward another furrow. "Here, for the dahlias you love." Ada smiled, a warm, quiet smile that seemed to brighten the morning light. It had been so long since she believed she could smile at small things again. They worked until the sun angled past the ridge. Calder repaired the low fence around the new plot, while Ada planted the first white daisies. The early spring wind no longer stung. It carried the scent of pine and new earth, the scent of beginning. That afternoon, Ada went to the women's meeting in town. Her heartbeat quickened as she walked in, an old instinctive fear lingering despite the recent warmth. Emma Brooks spotted her first. "Ada, come sit by me." The room hummed with soft conversation, gentle, steady. No one looked at Ada as an outsider anymore. No whispers trailed behind her. Nora Tillman handed Ada a small notebook. "We're planning spring planting for the families. Would you like your name on the list?" Ada held the notebook, uncertain, unused to being invited into anything shared. But Nora and Emma's eyes held no pity, no pressure, only trust. "I'd like that," Ada said quietly, and the women smiled. When the meeting ended, Martha Callahan draped a shawl over Ada's shoulders, her gesture tender and sure. "You belong here more than you think," she said. Ada stilled. Such a simple sentence, yet it reached the deepest part of her. The part still carrying memories of being pushed out of every place she once called her own. When she returned to the cabin, Calder sat on the porch with a steaming cup of tea, as though he knew exactly when she would appear along the dirt path. "How was the meeting?" he asked. Ada sat beside him, leaning her shoulder into his with the ease of breath. "They asked me to help plan spring planting." Calder smiled, his gray eyes catching the late light. "They know you have much to offer." Ada was quiet for a moment, then said, "Calder, I don't think I ever truly felt like I belonged anywhere. Not as a girl, not in my first marriage, not when I first came to Snowpine Ridge. But today, something felt different." Calder shifted closer, not saying much. With him, silence meant understanding. The cabin changed with the days that followed. Laughter appeared more often. The wind outside felt less harsh, because Ada no longer heard it alone. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, Ada stitching new quilt squares, Calder whittling small birds or spoons from soft wood. Such simple acts filled the cabin as though it were growing with their new life. One sunset, Ada stood in the yard, watching the young garden sprout. Spring wind brushed through her hair, carrying the warmth of soil and the sound of Calder's steps behind her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, a light hold, careful not to break the moment. "What are you thinking?" he murmured. Ada looked out at the garden, then at the cabin, each piece of it now telling their story. "I'm thinking," she said softly, "this is the first time I've ever felt truly seen. Really seen." Calder tightened his embrace. "You've always deserved that." The last rays of sunlight sank behind the mountains, leaving a wash of honey gold across their shoulders. Ada closed her eyes, breathing in warm earth and pine, knowing her life had finally found its home. Once Ada had stood in a crowd and felt invisible. Now, because of Calder's love, she had returned to herself, whole, strong, and seen. If this story touched a memory or brought someone to mind, feel free to share your thoughts below. And if you'd like to continue journeying with me through these gentle, heartwarming tales, please remember to like and subscribe. Thank you for staying until the very end. Wishing you a peaceful evening and a heart full of light.